What's up, everybody, and welcome to another Thursday edition of Ask Shane Anything, our new day for this show. This thing happens because some of you guys are pledging at $7 or more per month at patreon.com/SIFTD. Now, everybody gets to ask questions, everybody gets to watch the archive of this show. However, I do give priority to those of you who are pledging at those higher tiers when I decide which questions to include in the show. So thanks to everybody who supports us in any way. We have more great questions today. Let's get to them. Okay, first up we have a question from Squishy Muffin. Do you have any anecdotes of anyone that got into core gaming as an adult after having no real previous experience or exposure to the hobby? Should or does the industry advertise itself as a pastime to people who didn't really grow up with it or care at the time? As always, another great question for Ask Shane Anything. You guys knock it out of the park every single week. No one's ever asked me this. Here's what I would say. Yes, I do know people who got into gaming later in life. And not just got into gaming, but are like hardcore gamers. Now, the only way that that's happened, and 100% in every case that I'm aware of how that happened, is because they were a parent. And then they had a kid who really got into gaming. I think probably the clearest example of that I have is one of my uncles. He was always a cool uncle. He was into sports and stuff. I always enjoyed going to his house, just talking to him about whatever. Well, he wasn't so much into gaming. He knew I was really into it, and he knew it was like taking off back in the early aughts or whatever. And then he had kids, and his kids got way into gaming, like hardcore, like, you know, having LAN parties for Halo type gaming stuff. And then my uncle, their dad, got into it himself. Next thing I knew, I was coming there for the holidays. He'd be like, I just built my three sons' gaming PCs. Or the year a console would come out, like all his sons would get their own console. He was wealthy. But anyway, that turned him into a hardcore gamer. He ended up building his own gaming PC and got way into Battlefield. I've actually told stories before, I think on Invisible Walls, and maybe on Game Face once or twice, about his one son who was like 4 years old and was like a gaming prodigy. His hands were like this big, and so he played on a PC, but his hands weren't big enough so he could type. So he had to move his little hands all over the keyboard while he's playing Battlefield, and he would just murk people. I would go up and watch him play. He would finish matches with like 55 kills and like 10 deaths with a knife. It was insane. So anyway, his sons got really into it, and that got him into it. Now, to be fair, I cannot think of a single example of an adult becoming a core gamer later in life without the involvement of children. And I can give you like 10 examples of that. But as far as just like the industry converting someone to a core gamer who had no interest before and didn't grow up with it, I can't think of too many. And I have met a lot of gamers throughout my life. And I cannot think of a single one that was turned into a core gamer. So what's the problem here? I think the problem here is that we're going too far down the meta hole. And I think we're starting to exclude people. And I'll be honest with you, I deal with it on the website on a daily basis. When I'm writing blurbs, I think about like, okay, I got to be careful that I'm not writing this stuff for me and just for you guys. So like a lot of terms that we use, like JRPG, FPS, like a casual person has no idea what that stuff is. And while I'm not naive, I realize most of the people using SIFTD are core gamers. You know, you assume that later on it could become gigantic and you want to make it work for everybody. So I'm writing blurbs thinking of the future, not just the audience that we have now. This content's going to be on the site forever. So I think about it all the time, but it is very hard to convert people because, again, I feel like we've created this insular thing where we have like our own verbiage that only we understand, and we have all these genres and subgenres that only we understand. I often talk to casual people about games, and it's really hard if they've decided that they don't like it to break through the shell. So people that I know that I went to high school with, I'll run into them when I go home for the holidays or whatever. They're like, hey, yeah, I heard that you like review games for a living or whatever. And I'm like, yeah. And they'll say like, oh, I never really got into it. And then I'll try to like talk to them and become the evangelist for gaming, and they just immediately tune out. So I do feel like there's a huge barrier of entry there. And I think we've created the barrier because we have just created this kind of a subculture around gaming. And let's be honest, a lot of times some of the people in our community don't want new people in the community. I am the exact opposite. I want as many people in our community as possible. I don't care what color they are, whether they're male or female. I don't care about any of that stuff. I just want people in our industry contributing to the revenue so that we can keep getting games. And I do agree. The industry as a whole does a terrible job of evangelizing the industry to new people. It just does. Fortnite, I feel like it's broken through because it's become like a cultural phenomenon that every parent knows about and every adult knows about, because even if they don't have kids, like their brother's kids are playing it or whatever, it's kind of broken through the lexicon. And I do feel like the average person, when they hear that someone plays Fortnite, is like, okay. But I don't feel like that happens with any other game. So the industry, I feel like, has done a terrible job. There was a great quote today from Sean Layden. He was at Gamescom Asia or something like that. And he was just talking about how, like, the industry right now is designed for just us. This group of middle-aged men, basically, that want a very specific thing and keep asking for it. And when they don't get it, they throw a hissy fit. And so the industry, it's hard for the industry to evolve because they rely on people like us to keep buying the new games. And then they hope with their long-term plans, they can snare the more casual players. We're not helping. And when I say we, I mean, I am helping, actually. I try to ingratiate people to gaming. I don't care who they are. There's a segment of the core gamership that doesn't want new people in the industry. They want it to be this walled garden that will just slowly die. I really wish those people would just leave the industry and be replaced with people who are more positive and inclusive, because I feel like those people are what's going to ultimately kill the video game industry. Okay, next up we have a question from Khalib Twalai. Do you think it's fair that Pocket Pair is being sued by the Pokemon Company and Nintendo for Palworld when Pokemon has coexisted alongside Digimon for decades? Okay, this is kind of a gotcha question, and not towards me. I think just towards the industry in general. I think Khalib Twalai is saying, like, hey, there's like a double standard here, whatever. Why is this situation different than things in the past? But here's the thing. It is different. So there's a couple things I can point to that show you how this is different. The first one I would say is Transformers versus GoBots. I think a lot of people would say, hey, Transformers came out first, it had its own cartoon, and then this knockoff GoBots decided to like launch, and it was basically the same thing. You could transform from a robot to a car. But why did GoBots never get sued by Transformers? It's very simple. It's because you can't copyright a concept or an idea like that, but you can trademark and copyright the properties. And I would argue that if you look at Transformers and GoBots, you can see right away that they were different. The style of GoBots, and GoBots were just kind of cheap knockoffs as far as the toys are concerned, but even the cartoon, like, they just looked so different. It's like, yeah, they do the same thing, but it's very clear that GoBots is one thing and Transformers is another thing. Now let's talk about Digimon and Pokemon. It's the same thing as Transformers and GoBots. They do the same thing. It's a turn-based RPG, although Palworld isn't really a turn-based RPG, but if you go back, if you're talking about, Digimon and Pokemon, both turn-based RPGs where you have these little critters that you use to fight with instead of you doing the actual fighting. But nobody confused those properties, because if you would look at Pokemon and you would look at Digimon, the style of the creatures that you're using, the style of everything, was just extremely different. Like, I guarantee you could put a screenshot in front of me and not tell me which one is which of Pokemon and Digimon, and I can easily point out to you which is Pokemon and Digimon. Why things are different with Palworld and Pokemon is that Palworld looks and plays pretty much exactly like Pokemon. The creature designs in Palworld, if somebody put, like, look, I know, like, the first 150 Pokemon, and then probably, like, 10 or 20 new Pokemon from each game that actually stick in my brain and I remember. If you were to put some of Palworld's art in front of me and said, is this Pokemon or is this Palworld? I would not be able to tell you which. Now, I'm sure people watching this who are crazy Pokemaniacs would be like, I can tell you right away. I can't. And I'm a hardcore gamer, and most people cannot either. So it's clear to me with Pokemon and Digimon, which is which. With Pokemon and Palworld, it is not. And I think the other thing, too, is that Nintendo right now is trying to foster this new Legends spin-off from Pokemon that is more action-oriented combat, and in all honesty, a lot like Palworld. And now the problem is, its spin-off, the Legends franchise, Pokemon Legends franchise, is really blurry with Palworld, because Palworld has kind of the open world, can battle right there, you don't go to a separate screen, it's a little more active. The bottom line, is that Palworld and Pokemon are a lot more common than Pokemon and Digimon were. And when you start talking about the licensing of the characters for merchandise and other crap like that, it becomes an entirely different beast. So I understand the spirit of your question. I totally get it. But I do think in this case, it doesn't really apply. Okay, next up, we have a question from Bachby. With video games, most consumers have no idea who actually makes the games. Oftentimes, a reviewer or streamer of the game is far more popular than the person who actually made it. Wow. This is not the case with films and TV, but why? Well, I think there's a couple reasons why this is happening. I think the first part of it is perception. I think the average entertainment consumer out there, when they think about a video game developer, and I hate to say this, they probably think that the developer is an introverted nerd and someone that isn't all that interesting and someone that they don't really care to get to know. They love the games, but they don't really care about the people that make them. Now, when you start talking about films and TV, there's a whole other pop culture element that comes into play here. And I think a big part of it has to do with celebrity. Now, celebrities do work on some video games, but can you remember a time where a celebrity that was voicing a character in a game, or even maybe if their likeness was in the game, sat next to like the director and did like a Q&A together as a team? That never happens. But think about movie junkets and TV junkets and things like that. The director is there sitting next to the celebrities, or the celebrities are constantly commenting about the director. Well, he did this or she did that, and that made the film great, and I'm so glad I got to work with this person. You never hear that about video games. Every once in a while, somebody will say, oh, I got to work with Kojima or whatever. That's the extent of it. When's the last time you heard a celebrity talk about Miyamoto? It just doesn't happen. So I think it's a lot of the tangential pop culture stuff that bubbles up these directors of films and television shows into the pop culture lexicon so that people are exposed to them and they get to know them. I would argue that probably the average consumer has no idea who Miyamoto is. If you said, who is Shigeru Miyamoto, they'd be like, they would have no idea. But you could name, or they could probably name 10 or 15 movie directors. So the difference is the perception of the two art forms, the two styles of pop culture content. And the perception is that the people who make games are not charismatic, are not camera friendly. And that's completely wrong, obviously. They're people just like everybody else. But I think the other part, too, is that I think people maybe realize, even we realize, the director of a video game doesn't have as much control over the product as a movie director does. So, sure, Miyamoto comes up with ideas and he helps games become better, but he's working with, like, 300 some people. And maybe the best person on that team is the person who figures out like a gameplay quirk or something like that. And they're the most important part of that whole system of creating the game. With films, it is almost always the director, or it's almost always the writer who wrote the script for a TV show, or it's always an actor who nails the role. That type of stuff just simply doesn't happen in video games. And so I just think generally the consensus around games is that it is this kind of faceless, nameless thing where I'll just consume the end product provided that it turns out well enough. Okay, our last question for this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything comes from Kevin. Football Manager 25 was just delayed to March of next year, which is a big deal in Europe. It could potentially mean that 2025 will see 2 iterations of the game being released. Could you ever imagine Madden or NBA 2K skipping a year and then releasing 2 games in the same year? Well, Kevin, the first thing I'm going to say is I do not think that is going to happen. I don't think it's possible for that to happen. Because basically what you're saying is like, okay, they didn't manage to get this game done in time, and now they have 9 months to make the next one, and they're going to get that one done in time? It doesn't add up, brother. Here's what's going to happen. Football Manager games are going to start being released every March now going forward. And the good news is that they were kind of ahead in the year. They were releasing the 25 version in 2024. So it actually kind of works out. Now the franchise is going to start being released in the actual year that it's titled as. So I feel like maybe they just stumbled upon solving a problem that they had before. So now Football Manager 25 is going to be released in 2025. And now I would say that Football Manager 26 is going to be released in 2026. Problem solved, I think. Now, the other part of your question was what would happen if 2K or Madden didn't release in the year they were supposed to? It would be an abject disaster. Now, I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't know enough about the franchise or football/soccer in general to know if it applies to Football Manager 25, But when we're talking about NBA 2K or Madden, part of the allure of those is getting to play the new rules, the new teams, the new players who have moved to new teams, being able to experience that stuff before it's actually seen in the real game. We saw that this year with the new kickoff rules in the NFL. We got to play that stuff in Madden before it ever debuted in a regular season NFL game. Players that have switched from one team to another. Aaron Rodgers last year when he went to the Jets, you got to play as him on the Jets before he ever played a real NFL game. There's a preview aspect to the sports games in America that, in all honesty, I think is a big reason why people buy them. So if they were to miss a year of Madden and then release it, let's say, in December when the season's almost over, or NBA 2K, if they were to release that like in January or February when the NBA season is halfway over, it would be disastrous because a lot of the mystery around why people buy these sports games would just be gone. So I think ultimately, you're right, this probably is a big deal in Europe, but I think it's a big deal in Europe just because people want to play the game. And again, I don't know a lot about European football / soccer to know if there's this same aesthetic of like, wow, the season's about to start. We need to be able to start managing these new players and these new teams before the season actually kicks off. I don't know if that's the case, but I do know in America that would be a recipe for complete and total disaster. Okay, that's it for Ask Shane Anything. Thanks for watching. As always, thanks to our YouTube crew who seem to be watching this in bigger numbers pretty much every week. We appreciate all of you. If you really like this show, head to patreon.com/sifted and give us a pledge there. If you pledge at that $7 Ask Shane tier, it guarantees that this show is going to go on in perpetuity, and it guarantees that you will get precedent when we decide to pick questions for this show. So thanks for watching. Thanks for all our supporters, no matter whether you're giving us money at Patreon or you're just liking this show on YouTube or leaving a comment. We love you all equally. Have yourselves a great week, and we'll see you next Thursday.